The evening of February 13th, 1945, in the small town of Santa Fe, New Mexico, was no different from hundreds of other quiet evenings in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo. An inconspicuous car slowly drove through the narrow streets, its driver seemingly just enjoying the cool air. However, beneath this outward calm lay a meeting that would forever change the architecture of global security and deprive one superpower of its monopoly on absolute power. The man who emerged from the shadows of one of the buildings was a slender physicist with a deep gaze and impeccable manners. His name was Klaus Fuchs. In his hands, he held not just papers, but detailed blueprints of the most complex device ever created by humanity. That night, the secrets of a device capable of vaporizing entire cities began their journey across the ocean to the offices of the Kremlin, where they were eagerly awaited by a man whose name struck fear even into the bravest of comrades, Lavrentiy Beria. This was not an ordinary theft of documents. It was the greatest triumph of intelligence in history, allowing one side to catch up with the other in a matter of years, bypassing decades of trial and error. To understand how a German physicist found himself in the heart of the American desert with secrets of incredible importance, one must return to the origins of the great exodus of intellect from Europe. In the early 1930s, when the old world began to plunge into political instability, the continent's best minds realized that their knowledge could become a tool in the hands of those whose ideas were far from humanistic. Klaus Fuchs, convinced of the need for equality and social justice, left his native Germany, fleeing persecution for his political views. He found refuge in Great Britain, where his brilliant abilities in theoretical physics immediately attracted the attention of the scientific community. It was there, in an atmosphere of strict secrecy, that the project code-named __0_0__ began. British scientists were the first to realize the real possibility of creating a weapon based on nuclear fission. Fuchs, as part of this group, had access to the most advanced calculations. But in his soul, the conviction was already growing that such knowledge should not belong to only one side, especially if that side could use it to establish unipolar dominance. When the United States of America officially entered World War II and joined forces with Britain to implement the __1__, Fuchs became part of the British mission sent to Los Alamos. This place, cut off from the world by barbed wire and endless sands, became home to hundreds of geniuses. Under the leadership of Robert Oppenheimer, a mechanism was being created that could put an end to the bloodiest conflict in history. However, in the shadow of this scientific feat, another force was at work. Soviet foreign intelligence, codenamed ___2__, had already begun its subtle game. Lavrentiy Beria, who headed the USSR's atomic project, understood that the country's own resources, exhausted by the war, were limited. He needed the shortest path to a result. He bet not only on physicists, but also on those who could obtain ready-made information. Klaus Fuchs became the ideal source. He did not demand money. His motivation was purely ideological. He believed that a balance of power was the only way to prevent a future planetary catastrophe. The situation in Los Alamos in the mid-40s was electrified. While physicists battled with the problem of critical mass and synchronizing detonators, Fuchs meticulously recorded every step of progress. The main difficulty lay in creating a plutonium charge. Unlike the uranium design, which was comparatively simple and resembled a cannon shot of one fragment of substance into another, plutonium required a completely different approach. Spontaneous nuclear fission in plutonium occurred too quickly, which could lead to premature energy release and an inefficient result. The solution was the concept of implosion, an inward-directed explosion that was supposed to instantly compress the plutonium core from all sides, increasing its density to a critical state. This required mathematical calculations of incredible precision and the creation of a complex system of explosive lenses. Klaus Fuchs was the man who performed these calculations. He knew the design of Fat Man, the plutonium bomb, down to the smallest screw. Every meeting between Fuchs and his handler, Harry Gold, was fraught with colossal risk. They used a system of passwords and coded signals that might seem like something out of a spy novel if the future of humanity hadn't been at stake. Fuchs transmitted not just general ideas, but specific specifications: the size of the plutonium sphere, the type of initiator used, the wave impedance of the materials, and the precise timing intervals for the electrical detonators. In Moscow, this data landed on Igor Kurchatov's desk, the scientific director of the Soviet project. Kurchatov was in a difficult position. On the one hand, he received invaluable information that confirmed or refuted his own conjectures. On the other hand, Beria closely watched his every move, demanding results in the shortest possible time. Soviet scientists were initially not told about the origin of this data. It was presented to them as theoretical assumptions that needed to be experimentally verified. But the volume and accuracy of the incoming information were such that Kurchatov quickly realized that he held in his hands a detailed description of an already finished and functional device. The external conflict of that era was obvious: an arms race in conditions of total war. But behind the scenes, an even more intense struggle was unfolding. American counterintelligence and special services took unprecedented security measures, but they could not look into the minds of the people who worked side by side with Oppenheimer. Fuchs remained above suspicion due to his impeccable reputation and modesty. At the same time, the Soviet side played a double game. Beria, not fully trusting even his own intelligence agents, forced different groups to check the same information, creating a complex network of cross-control. He understood that any disinformation from the enemy could set Soviet science back years or lead to a catastrophic failure during tests. For the Soviet Union, possessing atomic weapons was not just a matter of prestige, but of physical survival in a changing world where former allies were rapidly turning into potential opponents. Klaus Fuchs's inner world during this period was an arena of struggle between loyalty to the scientific brotherhood and devotion to his ideals. He deeply respected his colleagues at Los Alamos, sharing everyday life and intellectual triumphs with them. But each time he transmitted secret information to Soviet intelligence, he felt he was fulfilling a higher duty. He was not afraid of the prospect of exposure. He was afraid of the prospect of a world where only one country had the right to impunity in the use of force. This personal dilemma of the physicist reflected a deeper ideological conflict. In the mid-20th century, science ceased to be a pure search for truth. It became an instrument of state policy, and scientists became hostages of the systems they themselves created. The clash between the principles of openness of scientific knowledge and the necessity of state secrecy reached its apogee precisely in Fuchs's fate. Particular attention should be paid to the technical details that Fuchs transmitted to Moscow. These were not just sketches, but complete documentation for the detonation system. The plutonium charge was surrounded by layers of conventional and special explosives, formed into 32 lenses. These lenses had to detonate simultaneously with an accuracy of millionths of a second. If even one of them had detonated slightly later, the symmetry of compression would have been disrupted, and instead of a colossal energy release, there would have been an ordinary thermal emission. Fuchs provided data on the composition of the hedgehog, the neutron initiator located at the very center of the design. This component, consisting of polonium and beryllium, was supposed to initiate a chain reaction at the moment of maximum plutonium compression. Without this detail, creating a working device would have been practically impossible in those years, as it would have required thousands of complex experiments, for which the USSR simply did not have time. By mid-1945, Soviet intelligence possessed almost a complete set of data for creating its own bomb. When the first successful test took place on July 16, 1945, at the Alamogordo test site, Stalin already knew about it a few hours later. And when President Harry Truman, at the Potsdam Conference, tried to subtly hint to the Soviet leader about the U.S. having a weapon of extraordinary destructive power, Stalin's composure struck the American delegation. Truman decided that the Soviet leader simply did not understand the significance of what was said. In reality, Stalin that same evening ordered the acceleration of work on the Soviet analog, using all the data received from quote, _1, Lavrentiy Beria received a clear order to create a copy of the American device as quickly as possible to guarantee the result. This decision, to copy the American design, became a key turning point in the history of the Soviet atomic project. Igor Kurchatov and his colleagues had their own developments, some of which were even more promising than the American ones. However, the risk of failure was too great. Under intense pressure from the country's leadership, scientists chose the path of maximum reliability. The first Soviet atomic bomb, designated RDS-1, largely replicated the design of Fat Man dropped on Nagasaki. This saved, by the most conservative estimates, at least 5 years of intense research and billions of rubles, which at that moment were vital for the restoration of a war-torn country. The transformation of the situation began in the late 1940s, when American Special Services, as part of the Venona project, began deciphering intercepted Soviet wartime dispatches. Fragments of correspondence were discovered, indicating the presence of a high-ranking source in the very heart of the Manhattan Project. Gradually, the circle of suspects narrowed until Klaus Fuchs came into view. By this time, he had already returned to Great Britain and held an important position at the Atomic Center in Harwell. His exposure in early 1950 came as a real shock to the Western world. It turned out that the man entrusted with the most guarded secrets had systematically handed them over to the ideological adversary for 10 years. Fuchs did not deny it. During interrogations, he behaved with dignity, explaining his motives in detail and emphasizing that his goal was peace, not destruction. The culmination of this story occurred on August 29, 1949, at the Semipalatinsk test site in the steppes of Kazakhstan. At 7 in the morning, a second sun rose above the horizon. The successful testing of RDS-1 marked the end of the American nuclear monopoly. The world entered an era of parity, which, despite all its dangers, prevented the Cold War from turning into a hot stage for many decades. For Beria, it was a triumph of his management and intelligence system. For Kurchatov, it was a relief and an opportunity to continue fundamental research. And for Klaus Fuchs, who was already under close surveillance by special services at that time, it was confirmation that his mission was accomplished. The significance of Fuchs's role in the transfer of nuclear secrets is hard to overestimate. He did not just hand over papers, he handed over time. At a time when every month counted, the 5 years of advantage that the Soviet Union gained became a decisive factor in shaping the post-war world order. Without this information, the USSR would likely have developed its weapons significantly later, which could have prompted certain circles in the West to consider a preemptive strike while the advantage was still on their side. Thus, the actions of one man, guided by his convictions, directly affected the lives of millions of people who were not even aware of his existence. Today, looking back at those events, we see a complex picture where science, espionage, and grand politics intertwined into an inextricable knot. The Manhattan Project and its Soviet counterpart became the first example of how information transforms into the most valuable resource on the planet. The story of Klaus Fuchs teaches us that in the world of high technologies, it is impossible to maintain a monopoly on knowledge forever. Ideas and formulas know no borders or barbed wire fences. They strive for dissemination, especially when backed by the iron will of some and the unwavering faith of others. The conflict of systems in the mid-20th century gave rise to a paradox. Weapons of mass destruction became a guarantee that large-scale wars between great powers became impossible due to the threat of mutual historical annihilation. Concluding this narrative, we return to that very evening in Santa Fe. The same cool air, the same outlines of the mountains. Klaus Fuchs, handing over the folder with blueprints, did not see this act as betrayal. In his understanding, it was an act of restoring justice. He receded into the shadows, leaving behind a world that would never be the same. His life after imprisonment in Britain and relocation to East Germany was quiet and dedicated to science. But the shadow of that decision, made in the New Mexico desert, accompanied him to the very end. The great hunt for intellect, organized by Beria, and Fuchs's intellectual gift created the foundation upon which a fragile peace rested for decades. This is a story of how knowledge, turned into a secret, can change the trajectory of civilization, and how one person in the quiet of an office or on a dark street can prove stronger than entire armies. We still live in the echo of that explosion that thundered in 1949, reminding us that balance is the only thing keeping us from the edge of the abyss. The drama of those years also lay in how accurately the Soviet machine was able to integrate foreign knowledge into its reality. Beria, being a tough and pragmatic manager, created a system where scientists were provided with everything necessary but were under constant scrutiny. It was a golden cage where intellect worked at its limit. Every message from Fuchs was analyzed not only for physical accuracy, but also for logical consistency. The fact that RDS-1 turned out to be almost identical to Fat Man speaks not of a lack of talent among Soviet physicists, but of the highest degree of trust in the intelligence provided by Fuchs. This was a unique case where the theoretical calculations of one person became the standard for an entire industry of a huge country. Research into this period allows us to see how the modern principles of strategic deterrence were formed. The lessons of the past tell us that any technological race, sooner or later, leads to equilibrium if the parties possess comparable intellectual potential. The role of the individual in history manifested itself here most vividly. Without Fuchs, the Soviet project would have taken a different path, perhaps a longer and more arduous one. Without Beria, intelligence data might have gathered dust in archives, never finding practical application. The combination of the scientist's ideological conviction and the statesman's administrative power produced a result that still provokes disputes and discussions. Ultimately, the story of the transfer of nuclear secrets is a story of human responsibility. Each participant in those events made their choice, guided by their vision of the future. For some, it was the defense of the homeland. For some, the salvation of the world. For some, the struggle for power. But common to all was the understanding that they were dealing with a force beyond human imagination. And when we recall plutonium schemes and night meetings in Santa Fe, we must remember that behind every number and every line on the blueprint stood a life, a destiny, and a hope that this knowledge would be used for preservation, not for destruction. This legacy remains relevant today, reminding us of the fragility of our existence and the price that sometimes has to be paid to maintain global balance. The journey of secrets from the tables of Los Alamos to the laboratories of Artemis 16 was full of drama and unexpected turns. It was an intellectual bridge thrown across the chasm of distrust and enmity. And although this bridge was built in secret, its influence on the architecture of the modern world proved to be fundamental. The feeling of involvement in a great mystery, experienced by all participants in the process, created a special atmosphere of that time, a time when physics became humanity's main science, and physicists its new prophets, and at the same time, its most dangerous sons. The legacy of that period continues to live in every international non-proliferation treaty, in every early warning system, and in the very fact that, despite all crises, reason still prevails over the instinct of destruction. Concluding this overview of the great confrontation and involuntary cooperation, it is worth emphasizing once again. Klaus Fuchs was not just a spy in the usual sense of the word. He was a conduit for ideas he considered universal. His contribution to the Soviet atomic program is not just blueprints of lenses and calculations of critical mass. It is the transmission of confidence that the task is solvable. In those years, the psychological factor was no less significant than the technical one. The knowledge that the adversary quote, _0___ already working provided an incredible stimulus for work. And it was this stimulus, supported by accurate data, that allowed an incredible leap to occur, transforming the post-war world into the reality we know now. The story of Klaus Fuchs and his role in the Manhattan Project will forever remain one of the most fascinating examples of how the intellect and convictions of one person can become a fulcrum for changing the entire world. Thus, no detail was superfluous in this grand scheme. Every word in a dispatch, every number written on a scrap of paper had meaning. And when we speak of nuclear parity today, we must remember that quiet physicist who once decided that the secret was too great to belong to just one. His act remains a subject of debate. Was he a hero who prevented disaster, or a traitor who betrayed his country's secrets? Everyone finds the answer to this question themselves, based on their values. But one thing remains undeniable. The world we live in was largely designed precisely then, in the 1940s, with the participation of people who were not afraid to take responsibility for the destinies of future generations.